Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to your number one and hopefully your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we continue to showcase more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from a way back in the day. Now, the first announcement that I have to make before we get into the next video is to say a massive thank you to all of the subscribers to my channel, because we have now surpassed that 18,000 subscribers total. So thanks again to each and every one of you out there for your support of my channel. So right now we're going to get down to business again and take a look at another British classic. Now, this bike of course is not a fully original bike from that year, but nevertheless an absolute belter of a machine. So let's get straight into the video and take a look at Stewart Roden's 1974 580 CCM. Okay, so this superb looking CCM specimen is actually a bike that I did a small feature on years ago when my YouTube channel was in its infancy, and to be fair, I never really thought I did the bike the credit it deserves at that time. So we're going to put that right straight away and take another look at the bike in much closer detail. And so our featured bike belongs to Stewart Roden, who actually raced many of the original Alan Clews bikes when these four-strokers were in their heydays of the 1970s. And Stewart was also a very good friend of the late Alan Clews when he would purchase all of his parts for his CCM bikes, and occasionally he would also get the guys at the CCM factory to do some repairs to his race machines. But anyhow, Stewart did stop racing for a good few years because he was then in the process of setting up his prestige car repair and servicing business, and it wasn't until years later when Stewart was in a conversation with one of his racing pals that the talk then turned to his days of racing these CCM bikes. And it wasn't long after that that Stewart decided it was about time that he got back on the track again and relive those great days of when he raced his beloved Alan Clews twin shockers. Now, fortunately, Stewart did have quite a good stock of CCM parts in his garage, because when he finished racing, he held on to all of his CCM spares that he'd accumulated down the years. So he certainly had more than enough parts to begin to build a bike. So after a quick inventory of the parts required, Stewart then got the spanners out and got down to business. But despite the copious amounts of spare CCM parts that Stewart had in his workshop, the one important part that he didn't have was a decent chassis. And naturally, these days you just can no longer pop along to Clews HQ to buy yourself a period correct frame. And besides, second-hand CCM chassis are about as rare as hen's teeth to find these days. But there was a solution, and Stewart contacted Joe Maxwell at Joe Maxwell Engineering in Dumfries in Scotland, who currently make reproduction frames for these 74 CCMs. So these Joe Maxwell frames that you're looking at here are carbon copies of the original Alan Clews design, and basically this is how one of these chassis would have looked like after their bronze welding and then eventual chrome plating, which of course these frames did have back in the 1970s. But these are very high quality chassis made from 4130 chrome moly steel, and was about the only choice really that Stewart had to source an original design of CCM frame to build his new bike. But as I said, these were more or less the very same design and quality that Alan Clews produced back in 1974. And so now that Stewart had the right skeleton to build his 1974 replica, next of course he needed an engine, and once more Stewart had more or less all of the original crankcases and internals that he needed in his spares parts department, but he would still have to source one or two components to complete this awesome BSA B50 engine. And so to build the engine on his reproduction CCM, Stewart started with an original pair of CCM crankcases as a starting block, and he then added a CCM crankshaft that he then lightened and balanced, and then fitted an aftermarket Carrillo conrod. Now Stewart also kept the original bore and stroke of the B50 engine, but he also did some further improvements to the engine's internal lubrication system by allowing more oil to be sprayed onto the lower part of the piston, which was often a problem on the 74 original bikes. And while he had the motor in pieces on the bench, he also opened up the barrel's exhaust port to improve the gas flow through the motor. Now some further upgrades were also done on the engine's cylinder head, and a set of big inlet and exhaust valves were then fitted to allow the engine to run that little bit smoother, and of course to let more fuel in and the burnt gases flow out a bit faster. Now when Stewart raced his original CCMs back in the day, he normally just used the stock CCM gearbox in his race bikes, but these again could often be quite unreliable at times, so in this brand new motor he's opted to go for a PES 3-speeder from Performance Engineering Services, and these PES cogs are superb quality and of course much more reliable than the old BSA parts. And again, the original CCM or BSA clutch that was fitted into these motors did work quite well, but they certainly had room for improvement, and once more Stewart has replaced that particular part with another good upgrade from PES, because these improved PES clutches are again very high quality, and they already have a proven track record to be very strong and reliable in these big B50 engines. But one other little modification that Stewart carried out on this engine was to upgrade and replace the gearbox lay shaft end bearing that was housed inside this crankcase. Now, these little bearings were originally needle roller types, and were kind of prone to failure if they never received their full quota of oil. So Stewart made sure that that particular part was now upgraded. And to supply the fuel for our big 580 CCM, Stewart's opted to fit an Italian Dell'Orto carburetor, which is now fueled and jetted to run on 105 octane fuel. Now, when Stewart first built this engine, he ran it on the more volatile methanol fuel, which he said made the engine very fiery and a bit of a beast to control. So he now runs it just on regular petrol, which he says calms it down and makes her much easier to handle. But the exhaust pipe for the CCM motor is just a simple straight through big bore pipe, and this part here was actually made by Stewart himself, which he told me took him about a week to construct. But I have to say it's almost indistinguishable from the original CCM pipe, and it even has this short stubby tail cone on this right hand side of the bike that of course the original CCMs did have in that year. But if you stick around until the end of this video, then you'll be able to hear this superb engine fire into life. Although another quite unique feature of these early CCM motors was to have the footrest hangers bolted onto the engine casings rather than have them welded or bolted onto the bottom frame rails in the traditional fashion as with most motorcycles. But in all of the years of CCM using this kind of method, there was virtually not a single report of casing breakage or other kind of damage, but keeping these footrests mounted in this higher configuration can certainly help stop them from being damaged. And so as we move onto the bike's front end, we have an original pair of magnesium CCM top and bottom triple clamps, which are super rare to find for these bikes these days, because Alan Clews did use a fair amount of magnesium parts on his machines to try and help reduce the overall weight of the bike. But certainly these magnesium parts, although they were said to be lighter, they were also very expensive to produce. And so the forks that are fitted onto Stewart's bike are a pair of Italian Marzoccis, and these have been treated to brand new upgraded springs and damper rods inside, and they've basically been tuned and fettled to suit Stewart's own riding style and the feel he wants for the front end of the bike. But the Marzoccis, even in their standard stock trim, were still decent suspension units for their day. Now, to cope with all of those bumps and oscillations from the back end of Stewart's big CCM, he's fitted a very good quality pair of Dutch-made Riger shocks, and these suspensions do have quite a good bit of scope to fine-tune them with regards to rebound and damping settings are concerned, and they're also a very popular choice among classic and twin-shock racers, because these Rigers do have a good reputation for their operation and reliability. So I can see where Stewart's thinking was with regards the bike's rear suspension choice. But back in the 1970s, many of these CCMs would have come from the Clews factory with just a pair of basic Girling shocks, or maybe even a set of conies. But without doubt, these more up-to-date Rigers will certainly be a massive improvement on those earlier suspension systems. And once more, in the early 1970s, CCM did manufacture many of their own front and rear brake hubs in that light and expensive magnesium compound, and as you can gather, those parts weren't produced in very high numbers, which is why you just can't lay your hands on those magnesium spares nowadays. And when they do become available, they certainly command big money. But in the place of the magnesium parts, Stewart has another quality pair of hubs from PES, who, as I said, are actually a good source of parts for these old CCM and BSA bikes. And because, as I mentioned, the original Clews parts are normally now unobtainable, these PES components are certainly a perfect replacement. Although, having said that, I've certainly seen micro hubs used on these reproduction bikes, where they normally just machine the ribs off of those hubs and then polish up the alloy, and to be fair, they do make a perfect replacement for those CCM originals, but these PES hubs are certainly well engineered and very good quality. Although certainly Stewart still looks to have a pair of original CCM front and rear backplates onto those hubs, and even these parts here are beginning to be very scarce to find in this modern day, so having a pair of original CCM brake backplates on one of these reproduction bikes is a very rare treat indeed. Now, if you know your CCMs, then you'll already know that this black fuel tank isn't the proper fuel cell for this bike, because back in 1974 it would have just been a simple polished alloy tank that would have been bolted onto this frame in that year. And in actual fact, this black tank has been taken from the 1973 CCM, which, as you're aware, was the very first true CCM that was manufactured by Alan Clews. But the only reason that Stewart fitted this 73 tank to the 74 frame was because this was just another one of the spare parts that he had lying around in his collection of CCM memorabilia from his past racing exploits. So he just then decided to put it to good use and attach it to this reproduction chassis. And besides, Stewart thought that it looked much better than the polished 1974 original fuel tank. And so the seat on this bike is yet again not your stock item that you'd find on your run-of-the-mill 74 edition of these Clews bikes, and this is a custom-made seat that was actually designed and manufactured by Stewart himself, and as you can see, it also has a generous amount of padding there, which is not really a bad thing on one of these old classic bikes. But this seat cover was actually designed by Sam Sibbald, who is another classic racer himself, and Sam designed and manufactured this fantastic seat cover while he was employed at the time by Transcal. So up at the sharp end of our Stewart Roden CCM, most of the controls on this bike are upgrades to what would have been fitted onto the original 74s, and to start with, it's a modern pair of Renthal handlebars with a quality pair of Pro Taper grips there as well. But this gasser throttle again looks like a quality item, and you would certainly need a steady hand on this twist grip to keep all of those CCM horses in check, because that big B50 580cc engine can certainly be a bit of a handful if you're not careful. Now, the bike's clutch and front brake levers are Magura alloy ball end items, which, as you know, were used on many off-road bikes way back in the 1970s, and these also have their leather lever covers there as well, which help keep dust, dirt and moisture from entering the cable ends. But another very good accessory to fit onto these handlebars are these plastic circuit handguards, which will certainly help prevent Stewart's knuckles from being battered by stones when he's racing this bike at some of those rough, stony racetracks across the UK. But both the bike's side panels are alloy items that have then been shaped and polished, and some proper handmade fasteners were also manufactured just to hold them onto that Joe Maxwell chassis. And also these number plates and their numbers are parts that are pretty much off the shelf motocross items that you can buy at any off-road shop. But I've certainly seen this bike in action on the track many times, and it's without doubt a quick and agile machine with Stewart in the pilot seat. And when he's racing this bike in the pre-1975 class, it's more or less always up there running in the top 3 placings. But of course, Stewart's CCM here isn't your bog standard original Clews classic, because stock original Alan Clews racers are now becoming quite rare to find as the years roll on. But it's thanks to the skills and the engineering of the likes of Joe Maxwell, who's producing replica chassis for these iconic racers to hopefully continue the legacy that the great Alan Clews left behind him. Now, pictured here, you can see Stewart with his creation, and I'm pretty sure he's justifiably proud of just how the bike's turned out. But this is just one example of the collection of CCMs that Stewart has in his workshop, and we've certainly shared a few of Stewart's other bikes here on my channel in the past, and hopefully, if you're a long-standing follower of my CDB TV channel, then you may have already been able to see a few in the past. Okay, so we've had a quick look around this lovely bike and talked a little about some of the parts that are bolted onto it. So let's just now have a listen to what this bike actually sounds like when the engine's running. Now, naturally, you can of course start these CCMs on the Kickstarter in the conventional manner, or you can do it the easy way, as Stewart does, by using a rolling road. Okay, so there you have it, a quick look around Stewart Roden's 1974 remanufactured 580 CCM. Not, of course, an original bike, but nevertheless an absolute cracker and a fitting tribute to some of the great CCM bikes that Alan Clews produced in those glorious 1970s. So I do hope you enjoyed this latest feature, and don't forget, if these are the kind of vintage bikes that you like to look at here on YouTube, then I do hope you'll consider subscribing to my CDB TV channel. But we will be back shortly with more of these old school off-roaders when we all return to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.